and Dude Love comes to the WWF. Yeah. And you've said that that's kind of around that time when Vince became a fan of you, and he directed these Dude Love segments.
Well, I didn't know he was directing them. I just knew that it was me and JR, and there had been a really effective up-close and personal interview with Dustin Runnels, where he spoke to the crowd, and I don't remember who did the interview, and it was a multi-part, multi-segment interview that was edited into multiple segments over the course of 4 or 5 weeks, where he said, my name's Dustin Runnels, I have a character named Gold Dust, I'm trying to, remove myself from the shadow of my very famous father. He talked about his daughter and his wife, and that's what they wanted me to do. And I said, Vince, I understand that, but this character is effective, and I can prove it was effective because in the history of WWE, I was the only wrestler ever specifically asked not to participate in Make-A-Wish events. And that's true. And it broke my heart, and then Dave Hebner said, brother, you have to understand, this is supposed to be one of the best nights of their lives, and you're making it one of the worst. So I would ask like Bret Hart or somebody who had a wish visit. Nobody was requesting me specifically, hey, can I join your visit? I'd like to meet the kids. And apparently some of them were fleeing in terror. So the character was effective, and then Vince said, well, I'd really like people to know you. And I said, what if JR asks me questions I'm not aware of, I give 100% honest answers, but I do them in the character of Mankind? And he said, you think you can do that? And I looked at him and I said, I know I can. Like, for all the things I lack, that confidence. Now, there's a fine line between self-confidence and delusion, and I've stepped over that line a time or two. It's not pretty, but that night it was right up to the line. And what I'd like to do, which I haven't done, because we haven't talked about these segments on any of the other shows, I'd like to take you back. This is one of the biggest moments in my career. Take you back to a time. Now, I'm not going to put on the Mankind mask, but Mankind's more of a feeling than a mask, right? There's a lot more to the character than just a mask. And we're going to pick it up where I am relaying a story about being picked on by classmates who are throwing worms at me on the playground. Show of hands if any of you remember this part of the interview. It was a long time ago, right? It was 25, okay. I'm not quite there yet. Okay. I don't think it's meant to happen. Let's just go to the next question. Okay. They were throwing worms at me, Jimmy. Little wriggly worms. And what was I going to do? Was I going to throw them back? It wasn't a matter of them injuring me. They were injuring my pride. So you know what I did? I took the biggest worm that I could find, and I sucked it down. Do you think I got many dates after that? Do you think that there were girls who wanted to kiss a boy who had worms on his breath? I was a good kisser, Jimmy. But I never got the chance to prove it. What was I going to do? Practice on a pillow? And out of the darkness, I heard a voice that said, this is outstanding. And I was a made man from that moment in WWE. I only do 3 good voices, so I'll give you one other pretty good voice. I was riding with Stone Cold Steve Austin on the night that the first segment aired. And we're driving, and we drove a lot together in WCW, not nearly as often in WWE, but we were riding together that night. And he looked at me and goes, kid, what are they going to do? You going to turn your baby face? And I said, no, Steve, I think, Vince just wants people to, get to know me a little better. And Steve looked at me and said, you'll be a babyface in 3 weeks. And that's exactly what happened. There was no moment where I ran out and saved one of the good guys. Later on, I would try to save Steve Austin, and he kept rejecting me, weeks later, and that's what necessitated the debut of Dude Love. But fans just empathized with the character and enjoyed the character, and they became emotionally invested, and it was tough to boo somebody who was working so hard for their entertainment dollar. So it was a really cool turn, and it was helped by the fact that I was working with Triple H when he was on his way, up the card. Wasn't yet at DX level, but he was, obviously a great worker, and he was able to bring out the best in me, especially when it came to doing comebacks, which I wasn't great at because I didn't have a lot of artillery. I didn't have the big moves, but we had some great matches. We had a fun time doing it, and that period of time in '97 after that turn, that was a really fun period for me.
And I believe that when you debuted as Dude Love, as Steve Austin's tag team partner, we just see the boots walking down, that Vince was involved in when you did this segment. And he was, and he wouldn't be doing that unless he really liked a character, right?
Yeah, he was invested. When he found out, and the way he found out, and the way this whole interview segment came up was that I was having matches around the loop with Shawn Michaels when Shawn was injured. But at that time, the champion had most of the weight in the company on their shoulders. Now it's more a situation where the brand is the star, right? And we've got big stars, but they're not as important as the brand. Kind of like UFC, where UFC can have a main event you've never even heard of, but you still tune in because it's UFC. Someone else in MMA has a few of the biggest names that have ever been in MMA, and they don't draw because it's all about UFC. But anyway, at this time, Shawn was carrying a lot of weight of the company on his shoulders. He wasn't in a situation where he could not wrestle, and he was healing while we were doing main event matches. That may have been just a little bit underneath the Shawn Michaels classics, but they were still really good, and I was taking really good care of him. And he said to me, and he didn't mean, he said, don't take this the wrong way, but I've written 11 books, if you include the 4 children's books. No sentence ends well that begins with the words, don't take this the wrong way, but. He said, did you always see yourself like this? Because this was the dark mankind. And I laughed, and I said, no, actually, I wanted to be you. So he looked at me kind of quizzically, because we'd broken in almost the exact same year. I said, not Shawn Michaels, but I had a character I wanted to be, and he was the same as you, in that the women loved him, the men wanted to be like him. And I told him about this character of Dude Love that I'd invented when I was 18 years old. Had no idea Bruce Pritchard overheard the conversation. And he went to Vince and he said, Vince, Mick Foley has a much more interesting backstory than you know, and he's got video of it. And Vince wanted to make that come true. For all his faults, I've heard he's got a couple faults. I love you, Vince. He genuinely likes to see people's dreams come true, and he genuinely loves his audience. Like, you'll never see a photo of Vince with a fan where he's not smiling, and he'll always say, without them, none of this is possible. He really appreciated the fans, even though it did seem at times like he was deliberately trying to piss all of you off, right? But in the end, he loved the fans, loved to make dreams come true, and I got a phone call early in the morning when I lived in the Florida Panhandle. He goes, hey, pal. I said, how you doing, Vince? Because I was likely just waking up. He goes, how'd you like to be Dude Love? And I said, like, for a few weeks? And he said, from now on. And that didn't happen, but what did happen was the 3 characters simultaneously, which no one had ever done. And it was just, that was the moment Vince became a fan. I'd always been told you couldn't really be a true, top-tier guy unless Vince was a fan. And that night, doing that interview segment with JR was when he became a fan.